Thank you very much. So I make this intervention, Madam President, on behalf of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, for the Regional Director for Africa. And I also join in acknowledging your leadership and thanking you for the transition. Even those of us in Southern Africa were very much with you for that peaceful transition, and that you achieved it without tanks in the street, if you know what I mean. Thank you very much. From the ILO perspective, migration today is directly or indirectly linked to the search for decent work opportunities. Even if employment is not the primary driver, it usually features at some point along the migration process. ILO estimates that there are 150 million migrants in the world, migrant workers in the world, representing 65% of international migrants. More than 80% of the migration flows of African nationals take place within the African continent. The statistics have already been given to us. And that while most African economies are growing at about 4.2%, most African labor markets are still characterized by a lack of decent work. African migrants, asylum seekers, and forced displaced persons often use the same migration routes. The lack of safe, orderly, and regular migration opportunities has resulted in a record number of them dying in the Mediterranean, as we see on TV. In addition, the world's refugee system is grappling to provide adequate protection to the long numbers of asylum seekers affected. The mixed migration flows phenomena, together with the threat of international terrorism, have had a consequence on policies that aim at determining migration and that have a negative effect on the protection of human and labor rights of African migrant women and men. As a consequence of the factors above, the most significant challenges faced by African migrant workers and their families include the rise in irregular migration flows, with women and girls particularly exposed to decent work deficits, often including forced and child labor situations, as well as sexual abuse and exploitation. The predominant security concerns that often put at risk the protection and rights of migrant workers and could have a negative impact on the labor market integration and free movement of persons within the sub-regional economic communities in Africa. The rise of all forms of discrimination, including racism, xenophobia, and intolerance. The increasing mobility and changing patterns of migration have demonstrated that the governance system is fragmented, with weak bilateral cooperation across migration corridors. Many countries and regions do not have modern mechanisms in place to address recurring issues such as high exploitation of migrant workers, workers' skills are not yet well matched to the jobs, and no processes are in place to recognize migrant workers' skills and prior learning. The lack of appropriate governance or adoption of international labor standards in migration policy create human and labor rights concerns and diminish what could be greater development benefits for migrants, home and host countries. Indeed, evidence indicates that poorly governed labor migration can increase the incidence of irregular migration and raise the risk of exploitation of migrant workers and governance challenges for countries of origin, transit, and destination. On the contrary, when labor migration is well managed, fair and effective, it can deliver benefits and opportunities for migrant workers, their families, and host communities alike. In this context, then, what is the ILO's approach and what is it that the ILO says could be done? The ILO has a mandate and a long-standing and extensive experience in labor migration and labor market issues. Its international labor standards have provided a foundation for nearly 100 years. As you all know, we are celebrating our centenary. Next year, it was formed in 1919, so next year will be our centenary celebration. In many African sub-regions, ILO supports member states on labor market issues, on employment creation and opportunities, enterprise development, cooperation across borders. ILO has adopted standards and tools and guidance that are important means for member states to meet modern challenges of governance at the national and sub-regional and global levels. We use these to support capacity building efforts in the region, such as to foster better data for evidence-based policy formulation, foster fair migration governance to ensure rights are protected before, during, and on return of migrant workers, access to skills development, skills upscaling, skills recognition. We also support institutional capacity building of regional economic communities in the sub-region to support bilateral and multilateral processes of cooperation. Being a tripartite body understands fully the significant benefits of social dialogue in developing migration policy, which lends durability and legitimacy to the issues affecting labor markets. There are good practices in the region which the ILO has supported in bearing fruit, such as SADC and ECOWAS tripartite mechanisms. ILO has also provided support in the design and implementation of labor migration policies in a number of countries and well as regional economic communities. Indeed, in the past few years, we have provided support to labor migration policy development in South Africa, in Egypt, in Seychelles, in Lesotho, to mention a few. In addition, EAC and SADC's labor migration policy frameworks have been mainly developed, supported by ILO in partnership with IOM, and we have provided inputs into the African Union migration policy framework. The ILO believes that if the Global Compact is to truly contribute to strengthening safe, orderly, and regular migration, priority should be given to facilitated labor migration that is well managed, fair, and effective. I'm sure there will be a presentation on the Joint Labor Migration Program, so I won't go into too many details on that. But in terms of how we can contribute, allow me to highlight not just what we can contribute, but some of the ongoing efforts that we are assisting in the region. We are promoting the ratification and effective implementation of relevant international ILO conventions, including fundamental principles and rights at work, which form the basis for managing labor markets in the continent. We support the development and implementation of coherent policies, labor migration policies, employment and national development and social protection policies at the national level. We provide support for adopting fair recruitment mechanisms and processes across migration corridors based on, among others, general principles and operational guidelines for fair recruitment adopted by government, business, and workers in September 2016. We support the adoption of skills recognition and portability mechanisms for skills acquired formally and informally. Is doing is to assist in raising at a higher political level support for all these ongoing initiatives. In the interest of time, let me stop here, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.